I thought we had covered this before, but I guess we didn't get all the way through it. Now, Joe Budden from the Joe Budden podcast, right? And this whole situation when it's breaking down with Rory and Mal. We were going through this the proper way. We were taking this through a spear almost of what it's supposed to look like when you go through a situation such as this. Joe Budden differs from Charlemagne. See, the problem is Joe should have never partnered with Charlemagne anyway, or never been friends with him, never tried to work with him, knowing that this guy was jealous of you the entire time. But you didn't listen to anybody when they tried to inform you this about Charlemagne. You thought it would be best to bring that information to Charlemagne and say, they told me not to trust you. And then Charlemagne would blow it off like, oh, you can trust me, Joe. I know what's best for you. Just stick next to me, and I'll help you get to the top. Okay, Joe? Because I really care about Joe Budden. I love Joe Budden, and I want him to do the best. That's what Charlemagne would say. And then Joe Budden would come in and defend it and let Charlemagne talk about his friends any old kind of way because he never really was friends with these guys. In their mind, they thought they were friends. You guys were just tools that was useful to help get Joe to where Joe wanted to be. Now, Joe did an equity deal with you guys because he didn't know anything about business. And putting you guys on salary at that time would have basically bankrupt the entire thing that they were building. So doing an equity deal seemed to be the most financially appeasing piece of the puzzle. But when you have a big old production, you have all these people to pay, it turns into more of a task than you were expecting. Finances weren't what you were thinking when you got the Spotify deal. How much you actually have to pay to keep the whole event running. So Joe started fighting the good fight people. Joe decided, I'm going to try to own my own entity. I want to keep my IP address. He didn't even know what it was worth at first. Then he, was reportedly asking for astronomical amount of money based on what the Joe Rogan podcast was getting. But those are two different avenues, two different metrics as far as traffic and audience. And the fact that Spotify really was like, we really don't deal with this type of content here, but we'll give Joe a chance. They basically just threw a deal out there. But this arena was not good, and Joe realized that I do all this work to help build this show and do this. Why build this up just to hand it over and make money for someone else and get a piece of it? Why not try to own all of it? Right? Own all of it and keep all the revenue. But here's how that scenario normally goes, ladies and gentlemen. Joe Budden forgot something that many people who sided with Joe in this situation don't really understand. Most people who side with Joe did so because they came in when it was the Joe Budden podcast. A lot of people don't remember when the name of this podcast was I'll Name This Podcast Later, which is a much better name than the Joe Budden podcast. But for rebranding purposes, the Joe Budden podcast, it had to be, for branding situations, but we'll get there. Joe clearly forgot the value of Rory and Mal. Since most of his subscribers have come on this page of his and joined and put the show on the Joe Budden podcast instead of the podcast having its own YouTube. and Joe having his own private. Joe used it to build up his own revenue. Those Love and Hip Hop shows, yeah, he was doing those. And when he had those Love and Hip Hop shows, his subscriber base wasn't through the roof. He didn't get all those traffics from Love and Hip Hop. That's real talk. He's been on all those shows. Right? All those Mona Scott shows. And come on. Really? Really? Been on those platforms. Where was all of this then? It didn't exist, did it? Did not exist. Now, you put Mal in on the show, then Rory comes. The show starts to have better momentum, and the show numbers go up based off of the podcast show. And your subscriber base started to go up. So when Rory and Mal said, hey, you're putting the show content on your YouTube page, shouldn't we get a piece of that? And Joe was like, well, you guys could have came out with your own YouTube pages, and then you could have used the same content. I'll allow you guys to use it. Which Joe was implying he was the boss and they worked for him. But that wasn't the case, or how their contract was structured. But Joe still was treating them as such. They had an equity deal, which means that they're all individual contractors, they all are bosses, and they all are responsible. So when Joe told Mal he had no place in the conversation, he actually did. Because they're actually partners and not employees. So when they asked for a list of accounting, they didn't want an Excel spreadsheet that someone could make at home and break down the list of accounting. They wanted to know what and where the money was going and what was coming in and what was theirs and what was Joe's. Joe believes his money is his money. And that's it, even when it comes in for the company. Joe Budden gets a Cash App situation. It's his Cash App deal, not the Joe Budden podcast, even though his Cash App deal is based on the podcast show. Rory and Mal getting none of the Cash App money. So then they realized, wait, we're going to have to pay Rory and Mal too. So they decided, well, let's give Park some of this money. Because a lot of these people here are overworked. So let's try to give them some of the money. Joe said, no, it's not your job to pay them. It's mine. Once again, they were looking out for the staff and the crew members and the people who were there who felt overworked. Because it's more than what you see on the screen, ladies and gentlemen, to help put these shows together. So it's not enough money to go around. It's just like an R&B group. Eventually, the lead singer is going to go solo because there's not enough money in the group, if that makes any sense. That's why Wu-Tang Clan got all individual record deals, because there's not enough money in the group. Now Joe's out here with Amiri hats. It's like, I've never seen this dude wear an Amiri hat in my life. And Mal used to live with this guy. And sometimes you don't know someone until you live with them. I lived with a friend and realized Never live with a friend. It will destroy friendships tremendously. We are two different personalities. We were great as friends, but when it was time to go home, we went to our separate homes. Then we had to live together. That was a rough time to get through the lease. Because it's more like a struggle for respect. He's used to having his way. Now he can't have his way because he's now everybody else who he's lived with, he's been able to basically dominate. And I'm an alpha. You can't do that with me. So that wasn't going to happen. And he realized it. Like, damn, I'm screwed here. I don't like this situation. I'm like, hey, we stuck to the end of the lease. Just pay my half and you pay your half, or then we'll go our separate ways. But you ain't gonna be able to bulldoze me like the rest of them. No, sorry. Not happening. Now, back to this situation. Joe, as this podcast got offers and everything else, Joe was positioning himself to get money and then just pay people off what he felt they deserved. But what he wasn't telling people, and he wasn't even telling the crew, is that he was spending his own money from all the revolt shows he was doing. He's putting all this money into running his podcast. Now, why was he doing that? He was doing that because Joe was in a different mindset. He was thinking, we're going to have to take all these little side deals until we can get our situation together. But Joe started thinking, I am the boss. I'm bigger than everybody else. And when they were talking about renegotiating contracts, Joe was not going to ever redo that equity deal. Now the equity deal, they're worth too much now. Well, sorry. You got to have to pay them. So now when the contract is up, they're not going to take a contract. Who would take a contract where you put them on salary when they had an equity piece? Now that this thing is built all the way up that they helped build, they're going to go backwards? Why? Where does that make sense, Joe? See, it makes sense to you because Joe feels I should be making this lion's share amount of money, and I'll be making so much more of it if I didn't have these guys. Because it's all about me. I'm here. This show is popular because of me. Joe, you are one of the talents that make it go, but don't underestimate for a minute the worth of Rory and Mal. You've disrespected that. And because of that, this is why you're in this despair. Now, the Rory and Mal podcast show is early, but it has already shown effects to what Joe is doing. To the fact Joe had to address it on his podcast. Joe topics have been dry. His co-hosts, they have no insight. They have no sources. They have nothing to add. Where Mal has all these stories of experience. Rory has all these stories of experience because they've been in places, they've talked to people. People have seen them, they've seen in other places. These guys that you talking about, Ish and Ash and all these guys, no disrespect to these guys, but these look like guys that carry your bags. They're not going to go against status quo. They're happy to be there. And they have no real insight. They're not Rory and Mal. And it just doesn't click the same. And the fans are reacting to it as the numbers are dropped on the show, as they knew that they would. And because the numbers have dropped and the show is plummeting, is that Rory and Mal's fault? No, it's Joe's fault. Joe brought all this to himself. Now Joe is the one that has to deal with the outcome. It's a simple process, that's all. One Joe's going to have to deal with and live with because he made it this way. Once Joe told them he did not have to respect them, that he just freely gives respect, that he doesn't feel he owes respect to anyone. And they were clearly off base because Joe is like, I started this thing. I'm the one that kept it moving. So in Joe's mind, he feels like he was going to get to this point eventually anyway, no matter who was sitting in the chair. But the truth of the matter is this, Joe, you didn't get there by yourself. You got there with Rory and Mal. So there were a lot of people who you tried to minimize these guys' worth and said, well, I believe in paying what your weight is here. And if you're not pulling your weight, as if they weren't doing their jobs while they were on the show and they weren't pulling their weight. That's not how equity piece works, Joe. You don't get to dictate what somebody's getting paid, and that person could have said 2 words. They weren't fired. They did whatever they did in the contract that was required of them to do. So when the company's, wealth is going up, they get more. If the podcast is doing bad, then they're going to get less. So they took the chances and rolled the dice as this thing was growing. But you derailed all of it. And now you've made the show look ridiculous. Because you made it, your ego and pride is the reason it failed, Joe. Just like a lot of these other guys, they don't see it. They so self-righteous. They so believe all these opportunities and blessings was coming their way because of what they could do and not the help of others. You're in Park's house. That's Park's studio. That's Park's everything. You're renting his equipment. You don't even own it. That's telling, Joe. Very telling. That you've been successful, right? And now I guess you got some people that's going to help you rebrand and get things going. You got the logo now and everything is Joe Budden. I would have never let this podcast be called the Joe Budden Podcast without our names being mentioned. And then they say, oh, with Rory and Mal. They had to fight to get that done because you changed the podcast from I'll name this podcast later to the Joe Budden Podcast. But don't ever think it was just you, Joe. There's plenty of other who sacrificed to get where you are. Now you're reaping what you sow. Now, Rory and Mal, I always thought they would need a third when they did this podcast with Rory and Mal. I did not think the two of them could hold a show by themselves when it's just those two. There was no big discrepancy about whose name goes first. There was no big discrepancy on the logos with the 2 beards and the beard and the cap. I thought the logo was great. And they were big enough on their own to go out and do it. So I believed in it. Now, Joe has allowed academics to come in and berate his show. As of course, he don't want to mess up that position, so he can go in there and try to get a bag because he's pushed back to YouTube. And he's trying to get back on television and do all these other things. But nobody gives a damn about him. So that's his status. That's his situation. Now, Rory and Mal, they just kept it moving and chose not to bring the guy's name up on the show, where Joe would bring it up all the time and love to bring up all of these, personal things of Rory, to basically take shots at Rory all the time. Rory was the whipping boy. Even when Rory expressed to him off the air how he felt about it, Joe would do it and then apologize later, as if that makes up for everything. Now, for them to sit there and engage like this is great. To hold this down, I think it's great that they have made it and they're making it work. Now, granted, it's only been 5 episodes. They're still working, but they're on the right track. And that's showing everybody out there, don't be afraid to believe in yourself. If you feel you can do something, do it. Go out and do it on your own. Run out there and do it on your own. Quit trying to wait for somebody to do something for you. Just do it. Nobody gonna select you for anything. You want to sit around and be selected, or you want to get up and do something yourself? Just do it. So, on that note, hopefully we've cleared up this entire thing. I thought we've done all that before, as to explain why the numbers are what they are. But for some weird reason, on Monday and Sunday, people wanted to talk about Rory and Mal and Joe Budden. Okay. Hopefully, again, this is, clears everything up for you. So hopefully you're good, and you could hit one of the videos here, one of the 4 videos. I'm glad, everybody who super chatted, God bless you. I appreciate it. My Cash App is Carceno, Karceno, for those who didn't know. And if you're a subscriber and you like the video and like what you heard, and hopefully you guys come back. I'm out.